Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're going to be having a very frank discussion about gun violence prevention legislation. Joining me tonight are two powerhouse leaders from the Brady organization. Here in the first segment is Kris Brown. She is the president of Brady. And Kris, thank you so much for taking time to be here.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Brady, and for those who may not be familiar with the organization, has been doing this work for a long time. Actually, I'll let you explain the genesis going back to 1974, but this work is not new.
No, it's not new. Brady obviously is named after Jim and Sarah Brady. Jim Brady, of course, was shot in the line of duty while serving as President Ronald Reagan's press secretary. And in 1981, when that happened, their entire world was shattered. But they devoted the rest of their lives to enacting common sense gun legislation. And in doing that, Sarah wanted to get involved and first affiliated with an organization that had been around, as you're hearkening to, since 1974, called Handgun Control, Inc. She became very active and engaged there, really started focusing on what was wrong at the time with our gun laws, and one of the major issues that they focused on was the need for automatic background checks to happen. Before the Brady Law, their namesake, was enacted, there was no mandate that a background check occur. So they helped make that happen and turn it into law, but in doing so, they partnered with Handgun Control, Inc., and then after all of their work culminated in the enactment of the Brady Law in the 90s, the organization was renamed after them.
And of course it took years. It took years and years of advocacy and work going to the Hill time after time after time to talk to legislators and convince them that public policy was necessary to stem gun violence.
Yes. It's pretty amazing when I think about it, and I talk about this with folks all of the time, and we were just talking about this before this started, that change after it happens feels like, oh, that just happened and it was easy, right? But it was anything but easy. It actually took 6 years and 7 votes in Congress before the Brady Law was enacted. And the difference was made by the fact that Jim and Sarah knocked on every legislator's door, and they sat down and had conversations with them. They didn't care whether the person was Republican or Democrat. Ultimately, when that bill passed, it passed the Senate by unanimous consent, which is kind of unthinkable in today's politics. But I think it could happen again with that kind of advocacy and work, and that's certainly what Brady is focused on and doing at the federal level, is really continuing to work their legacy and make sure that we have common sense solutions that the vast majority of Americans agree with, like expanded background checks.
Exactly, and the rhetoric and how we talk about it and the messaging has it's evolved over the decades, how we talk about trying to prevent gun violence. And I would say that that's a newer way of talking about it, because we're talking about the impact. You know, a lot of people say gun control legislation, and that's an immediate pushback like, don't control me, liberty, freedom, my Second Amendment rights. And it's kind of like, but it's really not about anybody trying to take your gun. I think that's the biggest misnomer, misconception that is feeding the furious rhetoric right now.
I agree. You know, Jim and Sarah owned guns their entire lives and continued to own guns even after Jim was shot. This is a manufactured issue really created by the NRA, that somehow anyone that believes that common sense measures to save lives and ensure that there's not easy access to guns by dangerous people means that's about gun confiscation. It's never been about gun confiscation. And by the way, everything that we are focused on as an organization, including particularly expanded background checks and a number of other issues, by every court that's ever looked at the issue, has been upheld as entirely consistent with the Second Amendment. So this false equivalency that we sometimes hear, that these bills would violate individual Second Amendment rights, are exactly that. It's just simply false, and it's a false message.
It is, and when we look at trying to impact something that is truly a public health crisis, and daily, about 90 people a day die from guns, including children, but we can't really track that data because the NRA is a very powerful lobby, has made it impossible to get the funding and the public policy necessary for the CDC to actually track the incidence of gun-related deaths. So why people don't understand that the data tells the story, and if somebody's trying to prevent you from collecting that data, then there's something wrong there.
Right. The CDC actually does collect this data, and they provide some data to us. So we know, for example, based on the lagging indicators of CDC data, that about 40,000 Americans a year are dying from gun violence. 40,000 a year. And over 80,000 more people a year are injured by gun violence. We've lost more Americans to gun violence since 1970 than we've lost soldiers in all of America's wars combined. This is an undeclared war on American soil. Now, the point that you're making, though, is, I think, really important. Congress, about 20 years ago, banned the CDC from researching gun violence. Banned the CDC from doing that. And until this year, with this House of Representatives and a deal brokered with the Senate, there was no funding. But we got it this year. We achieved an unbelievable result, which is that for the first time in 20 years, we have $25 million appropriated, authorized, approved, and signed by this White House to research the causes of gun violence. And that's as it should be. It is a killer epidemic in this country and should be treated exactly the same way as we treat other public health issues. There's no reason to treat it differently.
So when we look at things that were previously a threat to public health, and the two that leap to mind are car safety, because so many people die in car accidents, and health-related illnesses due to smoking, lung cancer, emphysema. And so in order to try to mitigate, stem the tide of so many people dying in vehicular accidents or as the result of smoking, public policies were put into place.
Exactly. Right.
And so so when we talk about the fact that we should have universal background checks or greater restrictions on who should own a gun, have access to a gun, operate a gun, it's no different from saying you have to be 18, pass a driver's test, and be licensed to drive a car.
Right. And I think the public policy rationale around this is very clear. Look, we had an epidemic of traffic fatalities in the 50s before we had NHTSA and other federal agencies really looking to the kinds of solutions that could save lives. When we looked at the kinds of solutions that could save lives because of traffic fatalities, we didn't say, but limit your research in these other areas. What we said is, help find a way to ensure that we save the greatest number of lives possible. And what happened? National speed limits, bumper rails on cars, redesign of cars for seat belts and airbags. When you think of all of the redundant measures that we put in place, there are people alive today because that system of protections was put in. And aren't we as Americans worth that kind of investment to ensure that there are reasonable protections to stop a child from getting injured with a gun in their home? And by the way, 8 kids a day in this country are killed or injured with a gun in their own home. We are worth it, I think. And they're basic common sense solutions. Look, 60% of all gun deaths today in this country are suicide. We have a rising spike in suicide. Shouldn't we spend more money researching the role between suicide and guns? We know that access is one of the key measures of determining whether someone can potentially complete a suicide with a gun. So these are common sense solutions that absolutely require and mandate a public health approach, just like we did with designated driver, just like we did with secondhand smoke. It's exactly the same.
And so you were working at a federal level, to try to get these common sense gun solutions so that they are applicable to all 50 states.
Correct.
Obviously.
Yeah.
But each state has its own state legislature, and there are certain rights that were given to the states to make policy, including around guns.
Right.
So your organization is doing twofold work.
Yeah.
The work on Capitol Hill and supporting chapters individually in the states.
Yeah.
We're lucky that you're right across the river. Indeed, that's the great thing about being in Northern Virginia is that you're right across the river. Probably harder for you to do a public access show in Illinois or something like that, right? So we're very fortunate.
Yes.
But the fact of the matter is, it has to be a two-pronged. It has to be a two-pronged effort because the gun laws vary so much from one state to the other.
That's
like,
right.
Like the one handgun a month law that was repealed and has now this session been put back into place, is because so many guns were being purchased in Virginia and ended up in New York.
Correct.
Right?
And other states north of Virginia. But
So,
that they call that the iron pipeline.
And so those are the reasons that an organization like yours has to work at different levels, because from one state to the other state, it is not necessarily stopping the flow of guns into the hands of people who shouldn't have them,
no,
or have purchased them
That's
illegally,
right.
they're not registered, they're
That's
stolen.
Right. That's right. When we think about gun violence, Brady works across Congress, across courts. We've been bringing cases on behalf of victims for 30 years, and in communities, because it's not just the enactment of policy at the federal or state level, it's also enforcement, right? And the iron pipeline that you talked about, Virginia is a major contributor to that iron pipeline. That's the export of illegal guns all the way up the northern seaboard. Ultimately, that's an issue of enforcement. About 5% of gun dealers in this country are responsible for the sale of about 90% of crime guns. And where are most of those crime guns ending up? Mainly in urban communities, in black and brown communities that have huge rates of homicide. If we want to address that issue, we also have to address the supply of these guns into communities that most of the dealers never set foot in, have no part in, but they are clearly profiting from the sale of these guns illegally. So we're very focused not just on enacting policy, but also working with law enforcement and with the ATF, that's the agency charged with oversight of gun dealers at the federal level, to help target the dealers that we know are contributing to the worst aspects of the problem. We have to look at policy holistically at the federal and the state level, and the enforcement piece of it as well.
And that's something I want to delve into, as well as the impact guns have in black and brown communities.
Yes.
And the fact that we have issues with violence and mass incarceration and disproportionate representation among black and brown communities.
Yes.
When we come back from this break, we are going to be talking with Kris Brown further about the efforts of Brady to work on common sense gun legislation solutions for what is truly a public health crisis here in this country, and particularly in Virginia. We are also going to talk later in the show with, we're going to talk with Martina Leinz, who works here in Northern Virginia with Brady, and I want you to stay tuned. Join us, please, after this break.
There. Can I tell you a cat joke? Just kidding. Why did the girl ask the mushroom to dance? Because he was a fun guy. What do you call a pig that knows karate? Pork chop. Why was the basketball court all wet? Why? Because the players kept dribbling all over it. Can I tell you another one? So how does a tissue dance? Put a little boogie on it. What's Beethoven's favorite fruit? Banana. What is a boxer's favorite drink? Fruit punch.
Mom, I got it. What are you doing in there?
I got stuck.
Are you a dog?
I wouldn't do that. Have you seen the pliers? Where'd you find those?
It's not your birthday.
Sorry.
Bye, Grandpa.
Bye, Grandpa.
Take care of yourself.
What are you doing? What are you looking for?
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we are talking about gun legislation. We are in the middle, literally the middle, of our legislative session here in Virginia. And joining me in this segment is Kris Brown, who is the president of Brady, who works at the federal level with common sense gun legislation and also supports chapters around the country. Thank you so much for being here, Kris.
Thank you, Catherine.
So when we went to break, you were talking about how this gun issue affects communities of color.
Yeah.
And why we need to be concerned about that.
Well, you know, ultimately for me, it is a civil rights issue. You can grow up in a community as I did. I was raised in Springfield, Virginia, where I never heard the sounds of gunfire. And I was able to walk to school every day, not thinking that I could possibly be the victim of violence. We have kids, primarily black and brown kids in this country, that are living in cities where gun violence is an everyday reality, right? And although mass shootings get the headlines, and I don't want to minimize that, mass shootings are responsible for about 1 to 2% of all gun violence in this country. Everyday gun violence that kids, that adults experience in these communities is literally that, everyday violence. And it's having a huge impact on their ability to actually thrive and grow up in these communities. And we're not doing enough to solve it. So one of the things that the NRA achieved with Congress years ago is stopped the ATF, that's the organization that actually regulates gun dealers, from publishing the names of the dealers that are responsible for the vast majority of crime guns. Brady, as I said, has a legal function. We have sued the ATF to get this data, and it tells a really, really horrible story, which is this small portion of gun dealers is flooding communities with crime guns. And if you're someone growing up in these communities who's experiencing everyday gun violence, and it's easy for you to get a gun, often a gun sold legally the first time that falls into the criminal market, and you're experiencing gun violence every day, it's not an irrational thing to have the fear that somehow you need to have a gun. We're just propagating this sense of violence, and all of our policy focuses on the trigger pullers. It's not focusing on the gun dealers who are supplying the market. That's what our crime guns program is about. And the one gun a month bill that Martina Leinz is going to talk about later in your segment is an important way to ensure that we're limiting the supply of these guns into the criminal market.
And that is one good way of doing it, and you're absolutely right. We live close to DC, where there are drive-by shootings. Young people are killed all the time, sometimes accidentally. Yeah. Same in Richmond. You know, and again, they're communities of color, and people firing into the windows at night. Children are not safe in the streets of their own neighborhoods.
No, it's horrible, and I meet so many parents who, you know, are desperate for solutions that can make a big difference, and who are living and trying to raise their families in these communities, and are begging for more transparency from their government and more information about what can be done. What we're seeking is kind of basic democratic information that the access to which has been stopped. So that's a big part of this program, is helping educate the public about this problem and what they can do to make a difference.
So speaking of the safety of children, you have End Family Fire, which is another program.
Yes, we're really proud of that program. We launched that in 2018 after about 2 years of research. And this is really a cultural norm change campaign. It is our movement's version of designated driver and secondhand smoke. Where we started with it is the 8 kids a day that I referenced before, 8 kids a day who are killed or injured with a gun in their own home. And we realized the way the news media covers this is it's often 8-year-old accidentally shoots his 6-year-old sister. That's not really doing a public service, because these are entirely preventable injuries. So we sat for a long time with a wonderful ad agency in New York and said, we need to come up with a term for this. Just like designated driver, that was created by Madison Avenue. That term didn't exist. You and I know it because it successfully was launched and people came to understand what it meant and wanted to do something about it. Family fire is just like the term friendly fire. And actually, when you think about it, it's the same thing. And what we really learned is for gun owners who are making the decision to have a gun in the home, that decision is based on two kind of opposing ideals mainly, and this is based on a ton of research. Love for their family and the desire to protect their family, and fear of threats from the outside. And ultimately, the ingredient that we have to put in here is knowledge about the real risk of family fire and the solution, which is safe storage. You played one of our PSAs, but ultimately we want people to be driven toward a knowledge and understanding that a safe in the home can save the lives of their loved ones and others visiting their home.
That's true, and the Just Ask campaign too. I mean,
yes.
My children are grown, and I can't tell you the number of sleepovers that they went to when they were in elementary school and middle school that I never asked or wondered whether or not they were staying overnight in someone's home where there were unsecured guns.
I live in Arlington. I have an 18-year-old and 16-year-old, and I'm surprised how often I don't get the question and others don't ask it, because there's a certain assumption, well, people in certain neighborhoods just don't have guns. A lot of folks who you wouldn't necessarily think, people have guns everywhere. It's really important to ask, and that's kind of the correlation to the End Family Fire campaign, is normalizing the question. I have a young daughter who had severe allergies up until the age of 10 when she outgrew a few. I never paused to ask the question whether the person who she was going on a play date had peanuts in the home. Why would I pause to ask the question of whether there were guns? Right. We should ask it in exactly the same way.
The other contingent of young people that I want to talk about are the ones that have joined you in another program that you have around the Enough is Enough campaign. And one of the young women on your advisory board is a survivor of the Parkland shooting.
Alea Eastman,
yes,
who's amazing.
And you've got a podcast, and I want to alert people to the fact that you have a podcast, and it's quite interesting. People can go to your website and find it at bradyunited.org/podcast.
Yes, it's called Red, Blue, and Brady. You'll see that all of our marketing materials with Brady are purple, because really our entire origin is bringing red and blue together, and that makes purple. So the podcast has been, I think it's now over 50th episode, and in honor of Black History Month, I would encourage all of your listeners to go on. We're having fascinating discussions about the origins of guns in this country, about the issue of race, and some solutions that we're putting forward. Team Enough, the youth-led organization that was formed after Parkland, is a youth-led organization, just that, and it has an amazing executive council. Alea Eastman, who's a survivor of MSD, Robert Shentrup, whose sister died at MSD, a whole host of folks who are really interested in this issue are participating, and they're really, really focused in particular on passage of federal legislation, training and advocating the next generation of youth. We're working with March for Our Lives on a whole training program of bringing folks in to help lobby and at the state and federal level, and focusing in particular on the outsized impact of gun violence in Black and brown communities. That's a key focus of the organization. We're so proud of them.
And there's no better time than Black History Month to focus that, a spotlight on Black and brown communities and how they are disproportionately disadvantaged in so many ways,
yes,
including around gun violence.
Yes.
The other thing that you do is you support these 100 chapters all
yes,
around the country as well. So Brady is very busy.
We are very busy, but we kind of stand on the shoulders of giants, and we certainly do in terms of our advocacy work from folks who've been involved for sometimes a very, very long time, fighting the good fight, even in states like Virginia, where they were fighting even when the odds were ever against them. And they have created a situation, people like Martina, who you'll hear from later, where we can actually make a difference now. They help turn the tide, and now that public sentiment in Virginia has caught up with where we knew the issue should be for a long time, we have a huge opportunity to make some real change. And that's what we do to support our chapters all across the country who want to get engaged in our policy work in the states, but who also may want to get engaged in our programs. We very consciously have structured Brady that way, so it's not just reliant on necessarily changing the law, it's also a lot of community-based activities that some people want to engage in outside of politics, so
Absolutely.
people can pick or choose.
Absolutely, because a lot of this is changing behavior.
That's
Again,
correct.
you go back to,
exactly.
you know, do we lock our seat belts? Yes, we do. Do we put our children in car seats appropriate to their age and weight? Yes, we do.
Right.
You know, all of those things came about because public policy changed how we behave.
That's right.
And it normalized safety.
Exactly.
And really, that's what we're trying to do here. Normalize safety. And doesn't that sound very different from take away people's guns?
Well,
does it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, okay, normalize gun safety. Let's normalize gun safety.
Right.
Everybody all together, let's normalize gun safety.
Right.
Real quick, we have a couple of minutes. You are engaged in court cases as well, because that's just another advocacy for change.
Yes, so we represent victims of gun violence. We are often bringing cases against dealers who knowingly violated the law and sold guns to individuals who may have a criminal record, or to what we call straw purchasers, someone who walks in with someone who has a record and makes that purchase clearly on behalf of the person who's a prohibited purchaser, and that's unlawful. We've gotten about $60 million in judgments from dealers across the country since Brady has been active, and we're a nonprofit. We don't take a penny of that. We have the best lawyers in the country working on these cases, and our goal here is to change the industry norms. We want to celebrate the good dealers, and by the way, the vast majority of them are good, but we have more gun dealers in this country than we have Starbucks and McDonald's combined.
Wow.
So when I say 5% of the gun dealers are not doing the right thing, it's not a small number. And we're going to change that through our crime guns work, and we're also going to change it by having the best legal team who are bringing these cases on behalf of far too many victims who are losing their lives and losing their loved ones. And that's tragic. It's a uniquely American problem, and we will not stop until it's fixed.
And I think people should find out more by going to bradyunited.org.
Yes, please. We have a host of reference tools, programs. There's something for everyone. A lot of information there to research, and of course, contact information for any of us about getting involved in chapters, getting involved in Team Enough. So bradyunited.org, please go there for more information.
Absolutely. And I do want to mention that you are the first female president of Brady United in their history. You took over in 2017 as the president from being co-president. And I just want to say that there are reasons that women should be given more opportunities to show that they have everything it takes to lead, and to lead well. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Catherine.
So please join us after the break. As Kris mentioned, Martina Leinz is going to join us. She is the president of Brady, Northern Virginia chapter, and she has been in this fight since the Million Mom March in the year 2000. So after the break, you are going to hear what Martina has to say about what's going on in Virginia specifically.
I surrender.
All right, pal. Get ready for the day, buddy.
Hey, Dad. Hey, Dad. Do we have a gun?
What's up?
Do we have a gun?
Maybe you can make retirement happen. After all, you made this vacation happen.
Double points with every purchase?
Cleverly merging promotions.
Love it.
Cross-referencing travel sites. And booking all your flights with those...
Vouchers. I got us bumped.
They were like, oh. But now they're like... Aloha. You aced this vacation. Now get the tips you need to get on track at aceyourretirement.org.
I tried Oxy at a couple of parties. I thought I had it under control. I didn't know it'd be this addictive. I didn't know how far I'd go to get more.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth. What to expect when you're expecting.
Like here?
A teenager.
Today, I'm going to show you how to teen-proof your home. First step, hide the car keys. Preferably somewhere they would never look. Challenges will come up. Be ready for them. Hi, honey.
I'm ready for the... Mom, you don't use mannequins in the mannequin challenge.
You don't have to know it all to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will love you just the same.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we are talking about gun legislation, specifically here in Virginia, where we are in the middle of our 2020 legislative session. Joining me in this segment is Martina Leinz. She has been doing this work since the year 2000, and she has been president of the Brady NoVA Chapter since 2007. Thank you so much for being here, Martina.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So it's been busy, obviously, because there are a lot of gun bills that have been precipitated by the fact that the voters spoke in 2019 and gave us a majority, the Democrats a majority, in both the House and the Senate, making it possible to actually see some movement on some common sense gun safety measures. So you have a lot of bills and a little time, so I'm going to let you start where you want to on where we are with some of this legislation.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll just remind listeners that back in July, the governor arranged for a special session to deal with the gun violence issue in our state, and this was in the aftermath of the horrific shooting in Virginia Beach. And he very carefully put together a package of 8 bills which collectively would address the problem. And this was through a lot of research, a lot of data analysis, meeting with people, law enforcement, and making sure that all of the areas that needed to be addressed were being addressed. And you may recall that session ended abruptly because the Republicans were still in control of both chambers at that time, and they essentially just shut it down and said, we'll deal with this in November after the election. So those bills remained in the package that the governor has put forth for this 2020 session, and they're a terrific package of bills. They are very expansive, covering everything from background checks on all gun sales to some of the child access prevention laws that you and Kris talked about, and the necessity for making sure that guns are kept out of reach of the hands of curious children who might come upon them and then inadvertently shoot themselves or others. So we have had tremendous success so far. Many of these 8 bills have already passed both chambers, so undoubtedly the governor will sign them. There are a few bills that I'd like to focus on because we still have work to do here. As a matter of fact, one of those bills is a bill to limit the sale of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines that will turn an ordinary handgun into a killing machine, which is essentially what assault weapons are. Make no mistake, these are not weapons used for hunting. These are weapons with one purpose, and that's to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. They are weapons of war that were never intended for the civilian market. But alas, here we are. We have them on our streets. So this bill passed on Friday through the House Committee of Public Safety on a straight party line vote. Tomorrow, the full House will take up this bill. But there are a lot of legislators who frankly have been quite intimidated by the extremists who are threatening them, who are parading around with their guns. We all saw the images on Martin Luther King Day. And it's causing them to think twice about voting for a bill that they know will save lives. So they really need to hear from their constituents, giving them the courage to stand up for what is right for Virginians, what is right for public safety, and what is right for our children. So I would urge your listeners to please call their delegates. Call them tonight, email them, and urge them to vote yes on the bill. And it's House Bill 961, the Assault Weapons and High Capacity Magazine Ban.
Now that was the committee hearing where the Capitol Police had to clear the room because it was out of control. And I thought to myself at the time, at least they were not holding weapons, because up until this year, people took their weapons into the Capitol building and into the Pocahontas building, right up until the governor signed a ban on weapons in our state capitol. And I think to myself, how much more frightening that outburst and those remarks and threats would have been if someone had been openly carrying a gun. And to me, that's a gun used as an intimidation tactic. I mean, I go and advocate at the State House all the time, you know, and I don't always agree with my elected representatives, who happen to be David Bulova and Chap Peterson, but I don't need a gun to persuade them to my point of view. And I don't think anybody should be carrying a gun to emphasize their point of view. So that's just my 2 cents worth. But I am with you that people, if you don't know how your legislator is voting, but particularly your House of Delegate member, you need to just shoot an email tonight. It's easy enough to find the email address of your legislator or their phone number to call and say, you want Bill 961 to pass tomorrow.
Absolutely. And if I could just underscore that there are 3 legislators in particular that we're rather worried about. They should be voting for this bill, but we have some concerns. So if you're a representative, and you mentioned that David Bulova is yours, he is one of them. David Bulova, Danica Rome, and Carrie Delaney are all 3 that seem to be wavering on this issue. So they really need to hear from the majority
from their
constituents who want this bill.
Because that's the whole thing about reaching out to your elected representative. If they don't hear from you, then they don't think that it's something that you care about. When 100 people call or email or show up, then they understand that it's a mandate from their district, that the people in their district are asking them to represent their interests on this. So I am with you. Strike while the iron is hot, and people need to do this tonight.
Yes.
So what are some of the other bills you would like to talk about?
Okay, so there is a bill that, a very good bill, that would have moved the penalty, which right now is a Class 3 misdemeanor, for recklessly leaving a firearm in access of a child who then uses that firearm to cause injury to themselves or other. That's just a Class 3 misdemeanor. So there was a very, very good bill that would have elevated that to a Class 6 felony. Because as Kris noted in your earlier segment, there are far too many children living in homes in our state and in the country with unsecured firearms. So people that think that they have to keep a weapon loaded at all times for some supposed person who's going to come break in, well, that in the hands of a child can be deadly. So if the onus is on them to take responsibility, and that's what this bill would have done. The bill passed the House, but sadly in the Senate, Chap Peterson voted against this very sensible bill, and so did Cree Deeds. They joined with the Republicans, so in the committee they were able to defeat it, and this is really a shame. The good news is the bill is still alive because it did pass the House. So when crossover happens, the Senate will look at it again. So again, I encourage any of you that are in Senator Chap Peterson's district, please call him and tell him how disappointed you are in him for voting against this bill that will save the lives of children, for heaven's sake.
Well, and that's the thing. And I know that there was I think a bill specifically for daycare homes, because there was an incident 2 years ago, I believe, where a child was in a daycare home, put down for a nap in a room that had a loaded handgun, and he ended up killing himself. And so I believe that was even a separate bill specific to child care. What we're getting at with these bills is that we are looking at the impact of how these policies, to your point, will help to save lives. They're guardrails, they're regulations to normalize gun safety. I'm really kind of falling in love with my own term here. Let's all normalize gun safety. That should be a hashtag or something, because this is not designed to punish parents. And if Cree Deeds and Chap Peterson are looking at it this way, that you're going to end up punishing someone who's already suffered the loss of a child or the injury of a child, they're missing the point that if people are not already motivated to do this on their own, that there has to be something like getting a ticket for not wearing your seatbelt or smoking in a place that's non-smoking. We have to have regulations that say if you don't do the thing that is common sense to protect your own children in your home, then there needs to be something put into place to say there are going to be repercussions. You know, I just heard on the news tonight that the police department's going to be putting people out on the highways to check for people using their cell phones. Right? Because it's kind of like hands-free device, nobody should be. So as a way to change people's behavior out on the highways, they are periodically going to do this massive thing where they pull everybody over that they see using their phone. So this is kind of the basic tenet of, if people are behaving in a way that is dangerous, then you do something to change their behavior. And it has to be something substantive or they won't change their behavior. I think that's where we are with this.
This is exactly where we are. And sadly, it's back to the conversation that you were having earlier with Kris. It has a lot to do with messaging, right? And the gun lobby has been very skillful, and they have played to people's fears. And they have fabricated, if you will, threats that aren't really there. For example, they like to say that organizations like Brady are gun grabbers and they're out just to take away everybody's weapons, and that couldn't be further from the truth. We just want safety. We want people who are gun owners to be responsible gun owners. And we do want to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people who shouldn't have them, people who are already by law not authorized to have them, but because of gaping loopholes, they're able to access them very easily.
And this brings up the red flag laws. You know, domestic violence is a huge issue. One of the most dangerous times in a woman's life is when she is trying to leave a partner who has been abusive. That is the point at which she is most likely to lose her life. And yet, we have pushed back on the red flag laws as well. You know, saying, but why should we take the guns away? And you're preempting, and it's kind of like women die every day from intimate partner violence. And if we don't do something, then it is going to go on unabated. And I have a tough time understanding how people don't understand that. As we go forward and we drill down to some of these other bills, I really do hope that people who are listening and watching tonight understand that they can make a difference because of crossover, bills that are still alive in one or the other or both chambers have the possibility of being passed or going to conference committee and still being passed out of both chambers and ready for the governor's signature. And so if those at home don't believe that they can make a difference, they're wrong.
They are so wrong. I mean, they can make a huge difference. And all it takes is a phone call or an email, and it really makes a difference. And so I really urge people out there listening to please call their delegates tonight, ask them to support the assault weapons ban bill, and then follow what happens. And then when bills cross over and they're in the Senate, then call their senators and ask them to support the governor's package of bills.
And that's another good point too, is that the governor has put forth a package of bills. And I think people should pay attention to what those bill numbers are, because you can go on the government website for the Commonwealth of Virginia and it'll tell you everything that's going on with that bill, where it is in process, when it's going to be voted on. So when we come back from our break, we are going to continue our discussion with Martina Leinz, who has the skinny on what bills still need our support around common sense gun safety.
Nice going, Spencer. I can't believe we broke Old Man Hennessy's window.
Correction, dude. You broke. I just threw the ball.
This is really bad. What are we gonna do?
We?
Go to the door, ask for the ball back. Are you serious?
It's my ball, Myrtlebeck.
You're so dead. I'd run away.
Yeah, to Uruguay.
Kiss your life goodbye. Sorry.
Let's go. See you, dude. See ya. You never mean you're well.
Nice life. Some friends you are. Hi. Hi. Tell him it was an accident. And we can fix the window. Come on. I'll come with you.
Loyalty. Pass it on.
You go first.
A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's a matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about a rooftop fight. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Yeah.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Awkward. I'm the awkward silence. You try to avoid me, then there I am again.
But an awkward silence can be a great thing.
Like Kelly here is about to demonstrate.
You haven't really been yourself lately. Are you okay?
Find out how you can help a friend with their mental health at seizetheawkward.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're talking about gun legislation, specifically here in Virginia, with Martina Leinz, who's been working on this kind of common sense gun legislation for 20 years now. Thank you so much for being here, Martina. So we have a lot of reason to hope that some of the bills in the governor's package will be passed. There are other pieces of legislation that actually didn't make it out of committee, and that there are some that are probably going to be back again next year. You know, of the ones that you think have a chance of passing this year, I mean, I'd like to know what you think or you know for certain. Well, I don't guess there's any certainty, but the things that look like they're going to pass. Universal background checks on the sale of firearms. But just give us a little bit more background about what has happened during session this year, the things that have come up, the things that have been kind of a surprise or the pushback that you've seen around some of this gun legislation.
Sure. Well, you mentioned earlier what happened on Friday when they had to clear the room, and
yeah.
I was actually there. And, you know, I am very grateful that they weren't allowed to carry their weapons because they were intimidating enough without them. It was really disappointing to see such outrageous behavior. They leapt out of their chairs and they shouted and they were so disrespectful of the whole process. And, you know, if you have to fight that way through fear and intimidation, maybe you need to reevaluate what you're fighting for.
Yeah, true. And like I said, you know, taking the ability to carry the guns in the Capitol away, because I believe that, and I could be wrong about this, but it seems to me that they were able to carry guns in the gallery of the House, but not the Senate. It was something about that you couldn't have weapons in one of the galleries of the chamber, but not the other one. Like, why that makes any sense, I don't know. But I recall that the legislators talking about it were like, you know, we're sitting down on the floor with our backs to the gallery, and there are people up there who have weapons. And you know, we talked a little bit about before the show about the fact that a weapon is neutral. It doesn't detonate. It doesn't explode by itself. It sits there, and it's until somebody picks it up, it's just a very neutral thing. It has the potential to do something, but it can't do it by itself. So the whole factor is who picks it up, whether it's a child or it's somebody with suicidal thoughts or homicidal thoughts, or it's somebody who's angry, or someone who's in a fight with their intimate partner. That's what makes something that is otherwise neutral a very dangerous thing. And so trying to put parameters around who should own guns. You know, we require that a person be 16 years old, pass a driver's test, do on-the-road training, get their license, and renew their license every year in order to be able to drive a car. But there is no such parameters around owning a gun. And a gun is just as dangerous as a car is. It all depends on the circumstances, who's behind the wheel, who's holding the gun. And so in trying to help people understand how we were trying to shift the perspective on gun legislation to be about the safety of the people picking up a gun, whoever it is, whenever it is, and mitigating or trying to put restrictions around who should drive a car or own a gun. I mean, I hope that's kind of a good analogy of what we're trying to do with these.
It is, but you know, sometimes it isn't even really a permanent restriction. So you mentioned the red flag law. So another term for that is ERPO, Extreme Risk Protective Order. So very much like you would take out a protective order against someone. An extreme risk protective order is an opportunity for a family member who knows that they have someone in crisis and they know they have weapons and they're fearful that they're going to harm themselves or others to get adjudicated an order to temporarily separate the individual from their firearms. It's just temporary, and they can have their rights restored once the period of danger has passed. This is so critically important, particularly now when we know that we have an epidemic of suicide by guns in this country. It's really horrible. It's the largest concentration of gun deaths in the nation is suicide. So this is a way to combat that. But it's just temporary. It's not a permanent removal of the firearm, and that's what people need to understand. Many of these measures are not, they don't go personally as far as I wish they would, because we are very sensitive to the other side and to gun owners, and we want to find compromise, but compromise that will lead to public safety. And I think that with all of these 8 bills that the governor has put forth, that compromise exists. It's not going to harm anyone's Second Amendment rights in any way. All it will do is make the public safer.
So we can't end the show without talking about Second Amendment sanctuary cities, and the fact that it's just hundreds of people turn out to the high school gym or the city council and say, you know, if these regulations are passed, our city is not going to follow them, which it's a motion without any teeth, because there are not elected officials that are not going to enforce the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia. But I look at the psychology of why they want to have the show of you can't take away our guns, when in fact no one's trying to take away their guns. That's never been on the table to confiscate people's guns. Even with the assault ban, it's not like we're coming knocking on doors taking away people who already own assault rifles. So we're not taking away anybody's guns. And these common sense safety measures are intended to protect their communities and their families in schools, in houses of worship, you know, movie theaters, music festivals, all the places where people have, you know, suffered violence via gun. I think I heard that 90% of the counties in Virginia, there's 95 counties in Virginia, have declared themselves sanctuary counties or sanctuary cities. You know, what do you read into this? I mean, to me, it seems just like very sort of frenzied rhetoric. It's just like this thing that has spun up.
I think that's a great way to describe it, frenzied rhetoric, and it's because they can't argue the bills. There are no sensible reasons to oppose any of these measures, and they know that. So they have to create some kind of frenzy to divert attention.
I mean, the elections in 2019, clearly the candidates campaigned, I mean, on many things, but campaigned on putting into place stronger gun safety regulation. And those people were elected, and they took over the majority of the House and the Senate. So it seems like clearly a majority of voters in Virginia have spoken about what their priorities are.
Without a doubt. And I think the shenanigans that we saw during the special session, when the Republicans just abruptly ended it without even discussing any of these bills, was a signal to the Virginia voters that they were completely derelict of duty, and it was time to vote them out. And that's exactly what happened.
And I think people need to look at Virginia as a bellwether, too. I mean, the fact that in 2017, we had the freshman 15, some of the most diverse people that have ever been elected to our House of Delegates. And then we took over both chambers, very slim margin in the Senate. But, you know, we have tried to be inclusive about who represents the people of Virginia. And so these candidates that were elected to do this particular job of mitigating the harm that the people of Virginia are placed in because we do not have appropriate measures around the safety of guns. And so moving forward after crossover, which is tomorrow, February 11th, the bills get voted on in each chamber. We mentioned they might end up on a conference committee if the bills don't match. But ultimately, if they are passed out of both chambers, they go to the governor's desk for signature, which means that many of them, I believe, would take effect July 1. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So we have to look, so we have this space between when these are actually signed and when we actually see them go into effect. And in many cases, you know, I remember seeing an article in the Roanoke Times about online instructional training for guns, which looks like that was a bill that has passed out of the House to eliminate people being able to take gun safety training online, which never seemed to be a good idea to me, except I really didn't know that we were doing that in Virginia. But Kris had pointed out that some gun dealers make a lot of money off selling a lot of guns to a few people who then make a secondary market by reselling them. But there's a gun dealer apparently who did this online training and has this whole cottage business, you know, charging a fee for this online safety training. The issue I find with that is that, you know, if you've never handled a gun and all you're doing is going online to walk through the modules of, you know, when you've never touched a gun maybe or seen a gun, is not really a true safety measure.
No, it's not. And I think that is one of the bills that we will see pass both chambers and be signed by the governor to eliminate that and require you know, a much more comprehensive.
Well, it's something hands-on. I mean, it seems to me that the NRA started out way back at the beginning as being an organization that was all about gun safety and gun safety training. They were a group of gun owners, and the whole organization existed to train people to how to safely use guns. And somewhere they derailed, and they seem to be representing manufacturers of guns now.
That's exactly what happened. They did derail, and the board is primarily composed of gun industry manufacturers who, for them, it's all about the bottom line, and they stand in the way of even the most sensible legislation because it's a way for them to rile up their base, and it's really shameful. And they are not, you know, our grandfather's NRA. I mean, once upon a time, it was an honorable organization, but they have completely lost their way. And because of that, we protest in front of the NRA headquarters on the 14th of every month. The 14th now, sadly, is the anniversary of both the horrific shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School that took the lives of 20 children and 6 educators, and the shooting at Parkland and at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. So we're out there on the 14th from 10 to 11, and we've been doing it every month since Sandy Hook, so a lot of months.
A lot of months, and people are staying committed to that. And so if people want more information, again, you've got a Facebook page for Brady. There's the bradyunited.org website. You're on Twitter. There's lots of ways people can find out how they can become engaged, get involved, if this is an issue that they really care about. And I wish you every success.
Thank you so much.
In this second half of the legislative session here in Virginia. This is very important to the Commonwealth of Virginia. Clearly the voters voted people who would do something about this. So thank you for being here. And for those of you at home, thank you for joining us here tonight talking about gun legislation here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The legislative session goes to March 8th, and there is always a way that you can get engaged.